In a family torn between loyalty and truth, a mother faces the painful reality of her past choices. Years ago, she pressured her daughter into allowing a man, her alleged abuser, into the most sacred moments of her life. Now, with a newborn in her arms, the daughter draws an unshakable boundary: he will never be near her child. Through reflection, regret, and the voices of those who refuse to excuse generational harm, this story follows a journey toward accountability and healing. It's a raw, emotional exploration of love, protection, and the courage to break the cycle. Part 1: The Rule. The late summer air carried a kind of quiet heaviness, the kind that seemed to hang over the streets and settle inside the rooms of the small, two-story home. The visit was supposed to be a joyful one, a celebration of new life, a meeting between generations. After years of watching her daughter move through the milestones of adulthood, the woman now stepped into the threshold of a new chapter: grandmotherhood. She had imagined this moment countless times, picturing the warmth of holding her first grandchild, the scent of soft baby blankets, the way her heart might swell as she looked down at that small, perfect face. The living room was bright, the curtains drawn wide to let in the early light. On the coffee table, there were carefully folded baby clothes, a few bottles, and the quiet messiness that came with a newborn's first days at home. Yet, beneath the surface of the scene, beneath the comfort of warm colors and the quiet coo of the baby, there was something else. It was subtle at first, a small weight in the air, like the static before a storm. The woman noticed her daughter's posture. Though smiling, there was a kind of watchfulness in the way she moved, as if she were guarding something invisible. She listened as her daughter outlined a series of rules for anyone who wished to visit the baby. They were practical, almost predictable: washing hands before holding him, avoiding strong perfumes, no amber necklaces as gifts, giving the new parents space and privacy. Each rule seemed like a natural extension of care. Then came the last one. It was stated as firmly as the others, but with a sharper edge, a rule that stood apart from the rest. Under no circumstances, at no age, in no situation, would the baby be left alone with her grandfather. The words were clear, absolute, and final. For a moment, the woman's mind simply paused. She heard the words but did not immediately let them settle. They hung there between them, the quiet room suddenly feeling colder. It was an odd thing to say, especially now, and so specific that it immediately felt charged with meaning. Her father, she thought, yes, he could be irritable, opinionated, perhaps even unkind at times. But nothing in her mind connected those flaws to the kind of exclusion her daughter was laying down. The scene moved forward in small motions, the baby's tiny hands curling, the low hum of a distant car outside, the faint smell of laundry powder in the air. Yet in her mind, the rule began to grow heavier. It was not the first time her daughter had pushed her father away. For years, there had been a wall between them. Family dinners became awkward, events were skipped entirely if he was present, and her daughter's voice always cooled when his name came up. Invitations were refused. Excuses were made. And yet, the woman had always assumed this was simply a matter of personality clashes, pride meeting pride, stubbornness meeting stubbornness. There had been one particularly sharp break years ago, when her daughter was in her early 20s. The wedding plans had been nearly complete when the same refusal appeared: he was not to be invited. The woman had fought that, insisting that whatever differences existed should be put aside for the sake of family. The argument had been heated, leaving a silence between them that took weeks to fade. In the end, her father had been there, sitting stiffly at the edge of photographs, his expression unreadable. Back then, she had told herself she had done the right thing, upholding the image of family unity. She had not questioned deeply enough why her daughter's resistance had been so intense. After all, she thought, old men in her family had always been difficult, quick to criticize, slow to soften. That was just how things were. But now, standing in the bright living room, that explanation no longer felt steady. This was not simply disliking someone's company. This was a line drawn in permanent ink. Her daughter's voice continued, moving to lighter topics, but the rule still pressed against the woman's thoughts. She tried to recall all the small moments that might now look different under a harsher light, the way her daughter avoided certain seats at family gatherings, the years of refusing to attend holiday dinners, the quick tension in her shoulders whenever her grandfather's name came up. She remembered a few moments from childhood, brief illnesses, mood swings, unexplained sadness, that she had attributed to bad luck, to teenage struggles, to anything but something darker. The air in the room seemed to change, though nothing physical had shifted. The woman smiled at her grandchild, yet there was a tightness in her chest, as if some truth had been circling unseen for years and had now drifted close enough to cast a shadow. The rule was not explained. No reasons were offered. And yet, its presence spoke louder than words. Somewhere deep inside, the woman felt an unease she could not yet name. Outside, the day went on as normal, sunlight across the garden, the sound of a neighbor's lawn mower in the distance, the faint cries of a baby adjusting to the world. Inside, something had shifted, a small crack in the foundation of what she thought she knew about her family. It was only the beginning. Part 2, Cracks in the Past. The weeks that followed the first introduction of the newborn to the family passed quietly on the surface. Yet, beneath that calm, the mother's mind remained unsettled. She replayed moments from her daughter's childhood, scenes she had once dismissed as trivial, now tinted with a sharper edge of unease. There had been the time, years ago, when her daughter was only 8 and suddenly refused to sit on her grandfather's lap during a family holiday. At the time, the mother had brushed it off as a phase of independence. There was also the way her daughter would vanish into her room whenever her grandfather visited, keeping the door closed, claiming she was busy with homework. The mother had told herself that some family members simply did not get along, that personality clashes were a natural part of life. She had not thought it could be more than that. The memories stretched into adolescence. During high school, her daughter had grown quieter at family gatherings. She became more irritable, often retreating early to her bedroom after dinner. Conversations about her grandfather were met with short, clipped responses or silence. At the time, the mother had assumed it was teenage moodiness, a temporary rebellion against the older generation's traditions. But now, the pieces did not fit so neatly. Her mind wandered to the wedding, years before the baby was born. The argument about inviting her father, her daughter's grandfather, had been one of the worst they'd ever had. The daughter had pleaded, almost begged, for him to be excluded. The mother, torn between her loyalty to her father and her desire for a perfect family celebration, had insisted otherwise. She told herself it was important to maintain appearances, that family unity mattered above all. In the end, the daughter had reluctantly agreed, but her smile that day had been brittle. The mother could see it now in the wedding photos, a tension behind her eyes she had failed to notice before. It was around this point in the story that the narrator's tone shifted, drawing from a comment that had struck a deep chord. The single fact that you forced her to have him at her wedding instead of trying to understand why she was so adamant to not have him there is a hard failure on your part. She clearly gave you every sign something wasn't right. Seriously, even without SA, abuse can have a lot of shapes and forms. The single fact that you forced her to have someone she didn't want at her wedding is not right, no matter the reason. You need to seriously start to listen to your daughter and value her. Break the generational trauma. You failed her before but can do way better from now on. The narrator reflected on these words, letting them linger over the unfolding memories. The decision to insist on her father's presence at the wedding, once defended as an act of family duty, now looked like a line crossed, an imposition of her own need for familial order over her daughter's need for safety. The idea of generational trauma resonated in uncomfortable men's tempers and flaws were often explained away as part of their nature, something to be endured for the sake of keeping the family intact. She had grown up watching her own mother smooth over conflicts, telling herself it was better than living in open hostility. Perhaps she had simply repeated the pattern, without realizing the cost. The narrator's voice remained steady, but the undertone was heavier now. The past was no longer just a series of misunderstandings, it was a chain of moments where warnings had been ignored. Whether out of habit, fear, or misplaced loyalty, the mother had chosen to overlook them. She thought about her daughter's fierce protectiveness toward her newborn. It was not just about the baby's immediate safety, it was about drawing a boundary that had been denied to her in her own life. The rule about never leaving the baby alone with the grandfather was not merely a precaution, it was a declaration. A refusal to let history repeat itself. In revisiting those moments, the mother began to see that the cracks had been visible for years. They had simply been covered over with the plaster of excuses: she's just shy, he means no harm, teenagers are difficult. But plaster cannot hold forever, and the weight of unspoken truths eventually breaks through. As the part drew to a close, the narrator noted that the truth was not yet fully visible, but its outline was becoming clearer. The events from the past, once isolated in memory, were now linked in a chain pointing towards something the mother had been unwilling to consider. And once such a chain is seen, it cannot be unseen. Part 3: The Unspoken Truth. The days moved slowly after those memories resurfaced, as if time itself were hesitant to push forward. The mother went about her daily routines, tidying the kitchen, folding laundry, preparing quiet meals, but each task seemed to leave space for thoughts to slip back in. The image of her daughter's face at the wedding haunted her, that forced smile she had once taken for nerves. Now, it seemed more like a silent plea that had gone unheard. There was a moment one night, as she sat at the dining table staring at an untouched cup of tea, when a thought rose unbidden: had she already told me? The idea lodged itself in her chest like a thorn. Could there have been a conversation, perhaps years ago, that she had buried without even realizing? She tried to recall every serious talk they had shared during her daughter's adolescence. There had been one afternoon, her daughter perhaps 15, when she had come home from school visibly upset. The mother had asked what was wrong, but the girl had hesitated, staring at the floor, biting her lip. After a long pause, she had muttered something about not wanting to be alone with certain people at family events. At the time, the mother had dismissed it as typical teenage avoidance of relatives. She could no longer remember if her daughter had specified which person, or if she had simply chosen not to hear it. The narrator's tone grew reflective, pulling from another piercing comment that demanded to be heard. "Are you 100%, and I mean 100% without a fraction of a doubt, sure she never tried to tell you when she was younger? Because her phrasing makes it sound like she did, and you have blocked it out. I would suggest doing some deep self-reflection, and honestly respect her boundary with her own child. It does sound like you dismissed or downplayed a fair amount of behavior or mental health issues your daughter was going through, and that makes it even more likely you are forgetting, blocking out, or deliberately misremembering the situation or conversations from back then." The mother sat with that thought for a long time. Was it possible she had not only failed to protect her daughter but had also erased the warning signs from her own memory? It was a horrifying possibility, that the mind could edit itself in order to preserve a comfortable narrative. She remembered the way she had explained her daughter's mood swings to friends: "Teenagers are dramatic, you know how it is." She remembered brushing aside concerns when teachers had mentioned her daughter seemed distracted or withdrawn at school. Even when her daughter had refused to attend certain family holidays, she had accepted the excuse of being too busy, rather than ask why she might not feel safe there. There was another memory, sharper now, the year her daughter was 18, when they had their first major argument about the grandfather. Her daughter had accused her of always choosing him over her, and in the heat of the moment, had said something like, "You don't care what he's done." The mother had been too shocked, too defensive, to press further. She had convinced herself it was an exaggeration, just another teenage jab meant to wound in an argument. But now, with the benefit of distance, the words rang differently. They sounded less like anger and more like disclosure. The narrator observed that sometimes, the truth is not hidden by the absence of words, but by the listener's refusal to believe them. And once a listener is unwilling, the speaker often stops trying. The mother thought about the baby again. How small and trusting he was, curling his tiny fingers around his mother's thumb. She understood, perhaps for the first time, why her daughter's refusal was not negotiable. It was not a slight against the family or a whim, it was survival. The baby would grow up in a space where the boundaries his mother set would be respected, and that was a promise the mother could no longer afford to compromise. It was strange, she thought, how the past could alter in shape depending on the light in which it was viewed. Events that once seemed benign now felt urgent. Conversations she had minimized seemed loaded with meaning. And the absence of confrontation now looked like complicity. By the end of this part, the tension had shifted from confusion to a deep, uncomfortable clarity. She may never have a full confession from her daughter about what happened, but the signs she had ignored were no longer deniable. The truth might never be spoken outright, yet its shadow lay over every memory. And for the first time, the mother could no longer pretend she didn't see it. Part 4, The Confrontation of Memory. The next morning, the mother awoke to a silence that seemed heavier than usual. It was the kind of silence that pressed on the walls, that made the air feel denser. She stayed in bed longer than she intended, staring at the ceiling, listening for a sound that might distract her from her thoughts. None came. The previous night's reflections had unsettled her in ways she could not shake off. The memories she had pushed aside for years now paraded in front of her, each one asking the same question: why didn't you listen? She rose slowly, making her way to the kitchen. As she boiled water for coffee, her eyes wandered to the family photographs lined up along the counter. In each picture, the grandfather was smiling warmly, a pillar of authority and familiarity. She had never questioned that image before. But now, those smiles looked different, less like joy and more like a mask. There was one photograph in particular from the wedding. Her daughter stood between her and the grandfather. At the time, she had thought her daughter's posture was graceful, composed. Now, she saw the tension in her shoulders, the faint strain in her eyes. The photograph felt like evidence of a crime that no one had bothered to report. The narrator's voice broke the stillness, weaving in another voice, this time from a piercing piece of feedback that carried the bluntness of truth. God, this poor woman, having to invite her abuser to her wedding because you wouldn't respect a grown adult's right to say no, and made her miserable until she gave in. Good for her for standing her ground on keeping her abuser from her own baby. That is good mothering. Be sure you tell your daughter you admire her care and caution here. The words were uncomfortably precise. The mother felt as though they had been aimed directly at her. She replayed the argument leading up to the wedding. She remembered insisting it was important for family to be present, that it was only one day, and they could set aside differences. She had convinced herself she was doing it for the sake of unity, for tradition. In reality, she had been prioritizing appearances over safety. It was then that she realized she had never actually apologized, not for the wedding, not for the pressure, not for the dismissal of her daughter's fears. The closest she had come was a vague statement about understanding her feelings, but even that had been wrapped in defensiveness. Her coffee sat untouched as her thoughts grew. It must have felt like for her daughter, walking down the aisle, knowing her abuser was there because her own mother had insisted on it. The betrayal must have been complete, the pain sharpened by the knowledge that the person who should have been her shield had instead become the reason she was exposed. The mother wondered if her daughter had cried on her wedding night, not for the usual reasons of joy or exhaustion, but for grief. Grief that the day she had waited for had been marred by fear and violation of her boundaries. For the first time, the mother allowed herself to fully inhabit that scenario. And in doing so, she felt an ache so deep it seemed to hollow out her chest. She had not merely made a bad decision, she had become an accomplice to her daughter's trauma. The narrator noted that moments like these often arrive too late to undo the damage, but they carry the possibility of transformation. The confrontation of memory is not just about recalling the past, it is about standing in it, accepting its weight, and choosing never to repeat it. The mother thought of her grandson again. His face, unmarked by the knowledge of betrayal, seemed like a fragile flame she was determined to protect. She began to see her role not as a bridge between generations but as a guard at the threshold, someone who could finally say no where she had once said yes. She also realized that admiring her daughter's courage would not be enough. Her daughter didn't need quiet approval, she needed active validation. She needed her mother to say out loud that she had been right to stand her ground, that her boundaries were valid and necessary, and that the cycle of silence would end here. But the prospect of that conversation filled the mother with unease. How could she face her daughter without the conversation turning into a battlefield of old wounds? How could she offer an apology that didn't sound like an excuse? She rehearsed the words in her mind. I was wrong. I didn't listen. I let my own fears and loyalties blind me to your pain. Even in her thoughts, the words felt clumsy, insufficient. But they were the truth, and perhaps that was a place to start. By midday, the mother found herself sitting at the same table where she and her daughter had shared countless meals. The light streaming through the window illuminated the dust motes in the air, swirling slowly, as if time itself were holding its breath. She imagined her daughter sitting across from her, the baby cradled in her arms. She imagined saying the words she had rehearsed, and she imagined the silence that might follow. She understood that forgiveness was not something she could demand. It might never come. What mattered was that she stopped pretending the harm had not happened. In that moment, she made a quiet vow: the grandfather would never again be in the same space as her grandson. There would be no forced gatherings, no insistence on family unity at the expense of safety. She would carry the weight of her own guilt privately, but she would also carry the responsibility of making sure her daughter never had to fight the same battle twice. The confrontation of memory had stripped away her defenses, leaving her raw and exposed. But in that rawness, there was also clarity. She could no longer rewrite the past, but she could rewrite her role in the future. And perhaps, if she was careful, if she was patient, she could one day earn a place in her daughter's trust again, not as someone who had failed her, but as someone who had finally learned to stand beside her. Part 5, The Resolution. The days that followed were quiet but not peaceful. The mother moved through her routines with a heightened awareness, as though every action was a rehearsal for the moment she would face her daughter again. She cooked, she cleaned, she watered the plants on the balcony, all the while carrying an unspoken weight in her chest. Each morning, she checked her phone, half hoping for a message, half fearing one. There was nothing. The silence between them stretched like an untraveled bridge, still standing, but vulnerable to collapse if not tended to soon. On the fourth day, she decided the waiting had gone on long enough. She called her daughter. The phone rang until the voicemail took over. She didn't leave a message, her voice felt too fragile to be recorded. Instead, she wrote a short note, folded it, and placed it in an envelope. The narrator's voice drifted in, now carrying the essence of another pointed reflection, this one from a voice that seemed to speak directly to the heart of the matter. The single fact that you forced her to have him at her wedding instead of trying to understand why she was so adamant to not have him there is a hard failure on your part. She clearly gave you every sign something wasn't right. You failed her before but can do way better from now on. Show her she was right to trust you. The mother read those words twice in her mind, then began writing. Her handwriting was slow, deliberate, each letter an act of accountability. She admitted to forcing her daughter into an impossible position. She acknowledged that she had seen the signs but had chosen to look away. She wrote plainly, I was wrong. I valued appearances over your safety, and in doing so, I betrayed you. She made no attempt to soften it with excuses. She also promised that it would never happen again. She assured her daughter that the grandfather would never be near her grandson. She wrote that she admired her daughter's strength, that she saw it now for what it was, good mothering, protective and wise. When she finished, she sat for a long moment, the letter resting in her hands. It felt heavier than paper should feel, as though it carried years of unspoken truths. That afternoon, she walked to her daughter's home. The sky was overcast, the air cool and still. When she reached the front door, she hesitated. Part of her feared the door would remain closed. Another part feared it would open. Her daughter answered after a pause, holding the baby against her shoulder. Her expression was neutral, not hostile, but guarded. The mother didn't step forward. She simply held out the envelope. Her daughter took it without a word. They stood in silence for a few seconds, the kind of silence that held more than sound could carry. Then the daughter nodded once, a small acknowledgement that the letter had been received. The mother left without asking for forgiveness. She knew it wasn't her place to demand it. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at her cold tea. She wondered if her daughter would read the letter that night or tuck it away for another time. She imagined the moment her daughter's eyes moved across the words, imagined the tightening of her jaw or the softening of her shoulders. In the quiet, the mother realized something important: resolution did not mean erasure. It did not mean pretending the harm had never occurred. True resolution was about standing in the open wound and choosing to tend it, even if the healing was slow and uneven. Days passed before she heard back. One morning, a message appeared on her phone: "I read your letter. Thank you for acknowledging it. We'll talk soon." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was an opening. The bridge, long neglected, now had its first plank laid. The narrator noted that cycles of harm are rarely broken in dramatic gestures. More often, they are dismantled quietly, in moments of honesty and restraint, in the willingness to protect rather than to justify. The mother knew she would have to keep showing her commitment, not just through promises, but through actions. She would respect her daughter's boundaries without question. She would never again suggest that family loyalty required silence. She would learn, slowly, to be the kind of mother who listened first and spoke later. In the months that followed, she saw her grandson more often. Always in safe spaces, always with her daughter's comfort at the center. The tension between them eased slightly, not erased but softened by consistent care. Sometimes, when the baby slept, she and her daughter would sit in the living room in companionable quiet. They didn't revisit the wedding or the years of silence, not yet. But the mother knew those conversations might come, and she was prepared to receive them without defensiveness. She understood now that love without safety was not love at all. And perhaps, in this late chapter of her life, she could finally offer both. The resolution was not a single moment. It was a series of choices, made one after another, to honor the truth, to protect the vulnerable, and to let the past inform the future rather than dictate it. And though she would always carry the weight of what she had done, she also carried the quiet hope that, in time, her daughter might come to see her not only as the mother who failed her, but as the mother who tried, truly tried, to make it right.